Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Matthew 5:8. This week for visual art, we're going to look at Karita Kent's work, particularly Psalm 64. This piece is gorgeous. It's colorful, bright, and energizing, and it's an original print made with the media of serigraph, which means silkscreen. It's a great example of Karita Kent's work, and I hope you love her as much as I do. She's an incredible artist with a really meaningful legacy. Karita Kent was born in Iowa in November of 1918, named Frances Elizabeth Kent. Her family moved to Hollywood, California soon after, and she grew up attending a parochial school. Eventually, she was called to the religious life. She joined the Order of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, taking the name Sister Mary Karita. Karita studied art at Immaculate Heart College, and after teaching for 3 years in a primary school in British Columbia, Canada, she returned to Immaculate Heart College and began teaching on the faculty there. She earned the MFA at USC and eventually became chair of the art department at Immaculate Heart. Her work was primarily in printmaking, that's my discipline, and specifically serigraphy. She favored bright colors, interesting text arrangements, religious iconography, pop culture imagery, and abstractions of figures, street signage, and landscape. She was fully and deeply invested in issues of social justice, feeling led to be the hands and feet of Christ to her community, and to encourage others to care for their neighbors and get involved in their local spheres to work for dignity and justice of all people. Karita's work, Psalm 64, is a curious piece. We see a horizontally oriented rectangle that's then further divided into 4 quadrants with the rounded rectangular vignettes. Each has a different landscape image. The piece has 6 colors: a light gray, a dark teal blue, a medium minty green, a dense golden yellow, a super pale yellow, and black. The way that printmaking typically works is you have to print each color in a separate layer, and that's how this was made. So you can see the ink is translucent, which means that you can kind of slightly see from one layer to the next, and that subsequent layering of color creates these new values and colors as the work is built up. The print's a screen print, but I think the black letters are relief printed. You can tell because of the bits of thin black lines around the letters where she would have carved them out. The text moves us through the piece and each of the vignettes, echoing the cross form that we see and feel because of the placement of the 4 quadrants of the piece and the space between. In the middle, we see the work's title, Psalm 64, in a prominent and central place. I love this piece. I feel like the landscape elements are loose and expressive, and the palette is comforting and energizing at the same time. It's a favorite, and I would argue a quintessential Kent work. Here's the fun and curious thing about the piece. The text in the work isn't from Psalm 64 at all. I'm going to read Psalm 64 for you now, and this is the NIV translation. A Psalm of David. Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. They sharpen their tongues like swords and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. They shoot from the ambush at the innocent. They shoot suddenly without fear. They encourage each other in evil plans. They talk about hiding their snares. They say, "Who will see it?" They plot injustice and say, "We've devised a perfect plan." Surely the human mind and heart are cunning, but God will shoot them with his arrows. They will suddenly be struck down. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn. All people will fear. They will proclaim the works of the Lord and ponder what he has done. The righteous will rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. All the upright in heart will glory in him. So that doesn't sound or look like this work, does it? So here's the text from Psalm 65. Praise awaits you, our God, in Zion. To you our vows will be fulfilled. You who answer prayer, to you all people will come. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. Blessed are those you chose to bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. You answer us with awesome and righteous deeds. God, our Savior, the hope of all, the ends of the earth and the farthest seas. Who formed the mountains in your power, having armed yourself with strength. Who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of the waves, and the turmoil of the nations. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. When morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength. Who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. You care for the land and water it. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain, for so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. So that Psalm 65, is the piece's true inspiration. Why did Carita choose to misname or mislabel this work? Why did she take a psalm describing enemies, evil plotting, and injustice, and then make this work connecting it to the content of the piece from a totally different part of the biblical text? Maybe she just had it wrong. She's used to praying psalms as a nun of a religious order, and Psalm 65 is a favorite of hers. But that day in the studio, she miswrote and jotted down Psalm 64 instead. Once the films for the print were made, it was too late to correct the mistake, and she just decided to go forward. After all, this is one of hundreds of images she's made. Maybe, or maybe, and this is my theory, she knew just what she was doing. She was answering Psalm 64 with the hopeful and redeeming message of Psalm 65. You care for the land and the water. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain, for so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. Carita's purity of heart knew the wrongs of our world. She agonized and suffered alongside those she served and lived life with. She agonized and suffered herself with multiple cancer diagnoses, which eventually ended her life far too soon. But she always pointed to the good God has for us, even when it's not yet realized. I also think she's asking us to consider context. How do the Psalms relate to each other, respond to each other, serve as songs of praise, joy, lament, and suffering? Can a bright and beautiful work of art respond to our pain and suffering into purity of heart and gratitude and love? Carita died in 1986. She was diagnosed with cancer multiple times, and the last time the cancer of the liver wasn't treatable. By the time of her death, she had made over 800 screen print images of varied edition sizes. Her legacy lives on in her artwork, which has been collected and included in major museum collections all over the world, as well as the Carita Kent Art Center in Los Angeles. The center's mission is to preserve, promote, and advance Carita's work, teaching, and philosophy. Carita is a perfect example of the pure in heart, without a doubt, for me. Her work, even when it asks difficult questions, challenges injustice, and points to oppression, is full of hope. She points to Christ and the ministry of his life as motivation to care for our fellow human beings in this life. She asks us to realize an environment where we can shout for joy and sing. The vibrancy of her work, the accessibility and democracy of the message and the media she uses all point to a philosophy of value for each other because of our value to the living God. This is a quote from her, which is a favorite of mine. The person who makes things is a sign of hope. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God.